Thanks everyone for joining us. This is our first in a series around self-care for our Fusion 360 community. It's something new that we're trying, so thanks for joining us and being part of the journey. I'm Scott Reese. I'm the Executive Vice President of our Design and Manufacturing group here at Autodesk, and we so appreciate everyone who is part of our Fusion 360 community. So we wanted to invest alongside of all of you. So again, thanks for taking the time out. I know everyone is busy, but something that has been a constant in our lives, certainly for the last year, is change, right? Change is kind of the new constant. And it's probably going to be a constant for the foreseeable future. So as with anything, we feel like being able to process that change kind of in real time all starts with the conversation. And I know one of the things I've enjoyed is learning from one another over the last year about new patterns and the things that help us kind of get through and thrive in kind of the new environments that we're all working in. So today we're lucky to be joined by Melis Gikalu and Michael Stevens from a company called Create Space, who are the professionals in navigating change. So Michael and Melis are going to lead us through a couple of exercises and a conversation and share their wisdom with us, and something that we may be able to carry forward together. So Michael and Melis, why don't you introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about your backgrounds and what we can expect for the next hour or so.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott, and thank you to everyone for being here today. So yeah, my name is Michael, and I am a wellbeing and mental health advocate for a charity in the UK called McHugh Mental Health. I'm based in Leicestershire in the Midlands, and I'm also the founder of Create Space. Yeah, so I'll tell you a bit more about myself later, but pass over to Melis in the meantime.
Thank you, Michael. Hi, everyone. My name is Melis, and I'm the program director at We Create Space. And I'm a transformational coach and consultant as well. And I've also spent the last 10 years working at the intersection of creative industries, mental health as well, supporting businesses and future leaders to just empower themselves and really see mental wellness and well-being in the workplace as a competitive advantage. So for today, I'll be leading the webinar, and so I really hope that we get to kind of touch on specific topics that maybe resonate with you, and yeah, feel free to ask any questions throughout.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So Create Space is an organization. We design bespoke self-care programs, and we specialize in equipping individuals with the tools and techniques that they need to manage their own health and well-being, something that was incredibly relevant before the pandemic, and now even more so.
Thank you, Michael. It's always quite lovely. So everyone, again, thank you for just being here. And I think based on what Michael shared, I just wanted to start today by just prefacing a bit as to why we're here. Because as some of you may have seen in the news, the number of people looking for help with anxiety and depression has actually skyrocketed. Because during late June 2020, and Michael's going to pull a slide there, there's 40% of US adults actually reported struggling with mental health and even substance abuse. And with that as well, there's 31% who reported anxiety and depressive symptoms. And these stats were pulled from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. I'm sure now for some of you, this is actually not surprising. And this is why we're really talking about this, because in these times, it's actually okay not to be okay. If you think back to this year, we've had to recalibrate everything. As normal for most of us has literally been blown up in the air. And one of the things that COVID has done really is saturate our time, especially as people have had to play multiple roles whilst working from home, like managing their significant relationships as partners and, as parents even, and maybe sometimes caring for others. And as human beings, really, despite our best intentions, we are strictly just wired to stick to what we know, and we don't seek out change naturally. And so when big life changes like these, like the pandemic specifically, are actually forced upon us, it can be quite scary and irritating, and sometimes actually even exciting. I think maybe some of you actually imagine that at the beginning it would be like a big break, and over time, as it kind of lingered on, you may have started to notice the cracks. Being surrounded by so much loss and grief actually can sometimes feel like a weight in our mind and bodies. And maybe it was actually your tolerance levels or compassion that took a hit. And you saw this kind of show up with your family, and most likely with yourself. And so just to say this, it's actually quite fair that, at this point in time, we were probably all on the same boat. And this is why it's important for us to talk about change. So to varying degrees, we've all grappled to sustain our physical and mental and even emotional health. But here's where it gets really interesting and actually sometimes very challenging, because unlike physical health, mental health isn't visible. And it's not always easy to spot the symptoms. Some of you may be actually familiar with that old proverb of, putting on your own oxygen mask first. That's, I think, has probably never been more important. And so today's webinar, really, in a nutshell, isn't necessarily about how great or transformational change can be. It's actually really about exploring the real journey and challenge that change represents. And today we really want to equip you and maybe get you to reflect as well on how to become more agile at recognizing and being more agile again at supporting yourself through each stage of this process. So as I talk through the process as well, please, as Michael mentioned in the chat, feel free to put any questions. We'd be more happy, really happy to kind of answer them as we go along, okay? So let's just start things off again. As I said, this first module is around understanding change a bit more clearly. And together we'll investigate this journey and explore it through the lens of a practical tool called the change curve. And that's also known as the Kubler-Ross model. So just to simplify, this model was founded by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who's a Swiss-American psychiatrist. And in the 1960s, she basically used it to explain the grieving process. And since then, actually, it's been very helpful and widely used as a method to help people understand the significant reactions that they have to change and also help them to transition from the old to the new normal. Okay, so we're just going to go straight to the slide. As you see there, it does indeed look like a curve, but it highlights 7 key stages that people go through as they adjust to change. And so in this first module, we will only focus on stages 1 to 4, which are anxiety, denial, frustration, depression. Then we'll move to a conversation with Scott that will help us transition and explore as well change through storytelling. And Scott will share a bit more about his experience. And then the last module will basically talk and explore through stages 5 to 7, which are experiment, decision, and integration. And with each of these, we will actually review the mental and emotional and physiological components of each stage and offer you some practical tips to better manage them. Okay, so let's just go straight to stage 1, which is anxiety. And so when we really come to think about anxiety, it gets quite challenging sometimes, right? But at this stage, what the model tells us is that anxiety is the first thing that creeps up when the change is first introduced. So maybe reflect back on the pandemic, for example. Can you actually recall what, the first breaking news felt like for you? I know in my case, I actually just froze. And then I started to worry about everyone and everything all at once. You may even probably ask, well, how do you know, Melis, that this is anxiety? Well, in itself, anxiety is just an umbrella term that captures a range of uncomfortable feelings like shock, fear, worry, stress. And people actually experience anxiety very differently. So if we move on to the slide, you can see some of the key elements or how anxiety might be showing up as. So the first one there is just excessive worrying, as I mentioned in my case, or even having a constant sense of dread. You can have trouble sleeping and restlessness. And I'm not sure about you, but in the face of difficult changes, actually, it's been noted that sleep is the first thing that goes out the window. It can actually be fatigue, even if you've got enough sleep. Well, sometimes with the feeling of anxiety, it can often feel like you're not satisfied, and you can experience fatigue even throughout the day. So some people actually struggle to concentrate. And this is often as well a side effect of worry or even sleep problems, because people can struggle to really complete, their work assignments, or even maybe find themselves blanking out. Some actually might opt for procrastination. And this is actually unconscious. So there's nothing really to blame yourself for. But others as well, it might show up as irritability. And, there's also sometimes a range of physical symptoms like heart palpitation, sweating, and shaking, and even chest pains. So just to kind of counter that, here are some top tips for dealing with anxiety. And this is what our clients have found really useful. So things like, number one, really, short breathing exercises. So by regulating your breathing, you can actually get more oxygen to your brain and help yourself calm down. There's a good technique, and I think Michael walked you through one, but there's another one called 4-7-8 breathing, where you just breathe in for 4 seconds, you hold for 7, and you breathe out for 8. The second one actually is about limiting alcohol and caffeine intake, because that sometimes can aggravate anxiety and trigger panic attacks. A third one that's quite interesting, some of you may have heard of, is cold showers. This can be incredibly helpful because anxiety in itself increases the blood pressure. And so in theory, a cold shower just helps bring it down. And another way a cold shower works is by releasing or increasing endorphins, which are your feel-good hormones in your brain. And this is a great way to kind of counteract depressive feelings or even anxious feelings. And the last one is actually a mood diary. And I know some people might find this quite fluffy, but to be honest, simply just journaling each day what you're feeling might just help externalize something that may be troubling in your mind onto paper. And that simple way of objectifying a problem and seeing it, on a piece of paper might help bring some release. Okay, let's just go straight to the second stage, which is denial. And as part of this process, denial actually is really seen as the space where we start to create meaning based on the past, based on what we've lost. And we're mostly still in the state of shock because life as we once knew it has changed in an instant. So you'll see there in the slide that Michael's just going to pull, that when you're in denial, really, you just won't acknowledge a difficult situation. You try not to face the facts of the problem, and you kind of tend to downplay possible consequences of the issue. So how do we really cope with denial? And it might be that you need time to just work through what happened and adapt to these new circumstances. But it's really, really important to realize that denial should only be temporary because it actually won't change the reality of your situation. And so it's always kind of easy, to tell if denial is holding you back, but, sometimes, the strength might change over time. So if you find yourself in a position where someone who you trust suggests that you might be in denial about a situation or the change that you're going through, you might try these following strategies. So one is really honestly examining what you fear. Think about the potential negative consequences of what, not taking action might feel like. And you can also back it up by journaling that experience as well. Number two is really reaching out to someone. I know it can be quite tough to communicate with family because we don't often want to burden them. And I know this is something that's very common with men. And I think in my case as well, it might come with the fact that vulnerability wasn't always welcome at home. So it might be worth thinking outside of your family bubble, maybe looking at people at your work. Your line manager might not be the best person to reach out to, but a colleague you consider or a friend may give you that space to express your fears and emotions. 3, you may also want to consider participating in a support group. I know social media is super helpful, but a lot of people have created these WhatsApp groups where they have trusted people in that system. And it's kind of like a little buddy system where people who might be going through a similar change, a similar situation might help you connect more and reduce a sense of isolation. Number 4 really is about, trying to talk to a mental health professional. This is really in cases where you feel like you've done everything you can and you're still stuck in that phase. I just want to say more to this point really, because you also, might find it quite frustrating, when you're seeing someone that you love, maybe in that denial phase about an important change or issue, and you don't want to put yourself in a space where you feel like a mental health professional, but you want to do something. So before demanding that your loved one, in fact, just, faces the situation, you might just want to take a step back and try to determine if they just need a bit more time to work through the issue. Because at the same time, in doing that, you're actually creating a space where they're able to talk about the subject, which might actually make you both uncomfortable. But essentially, it's about people on the other side understanding that they have a level of security they need to share and move forward. Okay, are there any questions so far? Okay, so I'm just going to move on to the third and fourth stages. We'll look at them in tandem. So the third and fourth stages are frustration and depression. And these two stages actually are kind of like an accelerated dive down the slope. You can just see there on the slide, we're just straight down in the bottom there. So how does frustration manifest? Essentially, it comes up as blaming others. It can be governments, politicians, the status quo, even yourself. You can become reactive as well, people having a short fuse or lashing out at others. We can have heightened levels of stress that we feel in our body, or even sometimes, again, going back to the other slide, lacking sleep. We can also have maybe a level of tunnel vision where there's this inability to see past the problem. Number 5 really is around self-criticism, which can be quite challenging and also lead to depression. Moving on to depression itself, how does that show up? Depression essentially is often manifested as feelings of emptiness and worthlessness. Changes as actually people notice in their appetite, even losing weight. There might be a lack of motivation. It can maybe feel like your confidence actually has taken a knock, or you simply just want to avoid and isolate from people close to you, which can often add a wavering sense of guilt, which sometimes can be really challenging to move past. So in these last 2 stages, it's quite important to say that these are the toughest ones to bypass. And people often find themselves in what feels like a never-ending loop. And that's completely okay. You really shouldn't feel ashamed or embarrassed, because a lot of us actually currently feel or have felt the exact same thing. But so many of us actually, fear being judged for expressing those feelings. And so here are just some very practical tools that our clients have found quite useful to work through these stages. Number 1 really is exercise. If you think about physical activity being a mood booster, actually it can help regulate stress and adrenaline. And in a way that can just kind of release pent-up energy. So you can try going for a run, or actually just simply sometimes putting your feet on the ground might just help you find that level of groundedness. You can try venting as well. It's really important to say that, ruminating on your disappointment or even on your guilt actually perpetuates it. And so giving yourself that time to let it out is quite helpful, specifically with a trusted friend who's not going to judge you. But as long as you don't focus too much on it, otherwise it can bring back this cycle of, constant repetitive negative thoughts. Third one is just going outside, really. I think if you're lucky enough to have a backyard, that might help. Just going around the block also might just be super helpful. And depending on where you live as well, you might have a favorite park that, gives you that sense of just connectedness with nature. If you're crunched for time, I think just taking 60 seconds to get some fresh air might just help you recalibrate your emotional setting And sometimes actually, if you're lucky, having just a bit of sun might just change your whole mood. Fourth one really is about personal norms. And this is quite important and something that came up a lot with some of our clients, because when everything is stripped away from us, what do we really need every day to feel normal? And this can be just as normal as brushing your teeth or cooking a meal. And on the note of cooking a meal, well, just keeping your diet healthy and balanced also helps a lot. The last one really, which is probably one of my favorites as it's super practical, is called micro wellness. And this is simply having 1 minute of a brain dump on paper, just jotting down your thoughts in a quick manner. You can do a 2-minute meditation, which means you don't have to be a professional. Just taking that time off to connect with your thoughts and feelings might help. Or simply just taking a 3-minute compassionate break. That means just stepping out, if it's of your house or anywhere you may find yourself, just taking that time might help you just disconnect with the noise and at least see a different perspective. Okay, so just to kind of summarize and wrap things up before we move on to my conversation with Scott, it's really important to just preface and say again that often with change, and specifically when we're in the thick of it, we spend so much time fearing what is already here. And we focus on what was lost, on who we were, rather than who we want to become or even get to become at the end of that journey. So this is just a question to you, and you can drop something in the chat if you want, but reflecting on what you've heard so far on all of these stages as well, you know, what resonated more with you and where you're at? Maybe you know someone actually who's struggling at the moment. This might be worth kind of thinking about that and see what landed. And a quick note on the latter really is something that I found quite helpful, which people call the 2 OK rule. And we'll pull some polling questions as well as I talk into this. You'll kind of get to interact and maybe click and see what kind of lands with you as well as we go into the conversation. But going back to that 2 OK rule, it's just something that's quite helpful to connect and help others as well who may be in a tough spot. So when we ask people how they're feeling, you know, how intentional are we really about holding the space for the honest answer they might give us? So simple thing with this rule is that when someone asks you, you know, or even you ask actually, are you okay? If the person just says, I'm fine, just back it up straight away with, are you really okay? Because with just that second sentence and said second question, you're able to kind of give them the space as well to just open up a bit more. Okay, so in this section, again, to re-emphasize on, you know, the key messages is that whatever came up for you during the last year, or even what's happening for you right now, know that you're not alone. And this is why it's really important to just check in, but really check in with yourself and others as well. Because some of us have a tendency to just roll through the punches, and we may not even acknowledge the change that we've already gone through. And despite the challenges that change brings, you know, if we're just able to take a step back, access some support, share with others, or just gently recalibrate our habits when we have a level of awareness, then it might just help us to reset and bounce back. So in this next section, really, as I mentioned, I'll be actually speaking to Scott because Scott's kindly offered to share more about his experience of navigating through change. And so Scott, welcome back.
Thank you, Melis.
Hey, so Scott, how are you doing? Just putting it out there for everyone who's listening to us.
Yeah, I mean, as well as could be expected. I really appreciate the content. You know, I think that this last year has been a journey for everyone. And, you know, I think there's a lot of goodness packed into what you showed there. You know, the little tiny piece of advice that I would give folks is, you know, don't feel like you have to understand and own all of it. You know, look for the 1 or 2 or 3 little things that may work for you. I can tell you, I've tried meditating probably 1 million times, and it's the best way for me to get into a good deep sleep. I just haven't been able to really figure it out. But in the process of trying to learn, I've learned a few things that I keep with me, and breathing and being able to control my breath, which ultimately controls your heart rate, is one of those things. So that's my piece of advice: is don't be overwhelmed by all that content. Find the 1, 2, or 3 little things that may make a difference. I'm happy to share kind of my journey over the last year. I think that's one of the elements about the last year is it's we've all been in it together. No one has escaped the oddity of the last 400 days. And one phrase that I used early on in describing it is that we all have to embrace that we're all perfectly imperfect. In whatever the environment is, trying to say that we're okay and that everything is perfect. It's just not the case for anybody, right? And just be okay with that.
Thank you so much, Scott, for just landing that. And I completely agree with what you're saying. And it's almost like you were just dropping a teaser for the next series, which is really about finding a holistic routine and what feels right. So great that you shared that. So if we just circle back, Scott, I just wanted to kind of ask you, what have been the most, or what's been the most important change that's occupied your mind over the last month or so?
Yeah, there are a few things that I would offer. I loved your curve because I was thinking about how this whole pandemic kind of kicked off for me, and it definitely started off with denial. Like I think in my however long I've been working, 25 years or so, I've probably worked at home fewer than 10 days in those 25 years. Like it's just not something that I enjoyed. I like the camaraderie of being in the office. I like everything about being with people. And so I'll never forget when we first said, hey, we're just gonna, work from home for a couple of days. I'm like, it'll be a couple of days, it's fine. And then it was like a week, and I'm like, okay, it's a week, it's fine. And then it was like a month. It's like, a month, really? Okay, well, it's fine. And then it became really clear, like, look, this is gonna be 6, 8 months. It entered into this phase of just accepting it and ultimately figuring out how to make it work. And I feel like that took several months for me to do it. And there are a few things I think that I had to change. One was kind of my day. I think certainly for the last 10 or 15 years, I'm to the office by 7 o'clock every morning, and most of that day is filled with meetings. So I just tried to replicate that historical pattern in the work from home virtual world. And I would say for me, mentally and physically, it was a disaster. Like I felt awful. I don't feel like I was being super helpful. I don't feel like I was being very productive. And it took me a little bit to just embrace that, like, these dynamics are dramatically different than what I've been used to. And, being willing to make some changes in how I spend my day was definitely one of the first steps.
I really like what you said there about just the almost like backwards and forwards and assessing almost how, that change has been. And you talked about, dramatic. And I know that, when you're talking about the work context, you must have had a lot of responsibilities on your head. But I'm also thinking when it comes to the impact on family as well, how have you found that change as well to manifest?
Yeah, so look, when you think of the work from home during the pandemic in regards to family, I think there are some upsides, and then there are obviously some challenges. The upside, I've had more meals with my family in the last 400 days than, probably in the previous 10 years. So one of the things that I tried to do was block lunch and very intentionally just say, I'm having lunch with my family, and I'm not going to take meetings during that time. And I think that's one of the kind of the big buckets that I would advise everybody to do, and I suspect everybody's done this at this point, is to create boundaries as to, because, people say you're working from home, but you're really sleeping at work is the reality, right? Because that's where work happens now. But saying you have to very intentionally create those boundaries. One of those boundaries for me is I'm taking lunch every day, which is something that I wouldn't have normally done. And I tried to sit down with my family every day. This one's probably eroded a little bit, but I also tried to just create a space for work. And, that space is where I work, and everything else, that's where I live. And if I need to go back to work, even if it's in the evening, I try to go back to that space. And, I say that as I sit here at the kitchen counter. So that one has eroded a little bit as I've gotten more comfortable with working from home. But, creating new patterns is something that if you haven't done that, I think that's something that you really have to do, is don't assume that the old patterns work in this new way of working. And, something that I probably haven't done enough of, but I definitely encourage people to do it, is when you need time off, take time off. We can all only take so much. And, when you need a day off, just take the time for yourself. You're going to be so much better because of it.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Scott. And it's like a really nice segue as well to the next module, or even the next piece on the change curve, because you talked about, trying things out, really almost like experimenting. And so I'm wondering, when it comes to self-care, you talked about meditation earlier on that you tried, but you went back to the breathing. I'm wondering, what other kind of self-care practices did you include in this process of change?
Yeah, well, one of the things that I started doing actually pre-pandemic, and I figured out how to incorporate this in, kind of the working from home, is creating space in the morning to clear my mind. And so one thing that I had never really figured out in probably the first 20 years of being a working professional is how to enter your day with kind of a zero balance, if you will, from, hey, what's percolating in your mind. And a mentor of mine actually just about 3 years ago gave me some good advice to, don't start your day with a meeting, right? Start your day with some clear space where you can work the things that are going to bother you all day if you don't get them taken care of. Some of those things could be personal, right? Schedule an oil change for the car, or of course, clear out the inbox, to the, 50 emails that came in since you went to sleep. Whatever it is, take the time in the morning to just zero out that kind of balance, if you will, so that when you hit the day, you're ready to be present. Because there were a lot of times where I was always like checking my phone, because something was percolating that I didn't get taken care of. That's one thing that I would encourage people, whatever it is for you, that's what it was for me, is, clearing out that time in the morning so that I could take care of the things that were going to be on my mind otherwise.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Great tips there, Scott. My last question really before we kind of wrap up, and this is where we talk towards the end about integration. And I'm wondering, what's the positive thing that you've noticed about yourself at the end of this process, or even just where you're at?
Well, one positive thing is I figured out that I really do like my family, because I've gotten to see them a lot more. Because I have a little bit of a commute to the office. So I would leave normally by 6 o'clock in the morning and probably not get home until, 7 o'clock in the evening. So there was a lot of, meals that either got shortened or, throughout the day. And I really, really enjoyed, getting to spend more time with the family. I think that was a bit of a blessing for all of us, for sure.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Scott, for your time. I really appreciate you just sharing so openly with us and inspiring other people as well to take some of those tips away and carry them forward as well.
My pleasure. Thanks for leading the conversation for us.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you. So do we have, Michael, I know we wanted to send out a polling question. So all of you, we just invite you to take that time to just click as to what resonates with you, in this past year, which emotion, did you really feel most often? It might just be helpful to remind yourselves and, of where you came from and maybe where you're at now as well. Okay, we've got one question, I believe, that was sent through, so we'll get to answer them at the end. And so moving on, really, and so nicely framed by what Scott shared. The next module, the second module, really is called Posttraumatic Growth, and really finding kind of meaning in some level of creativity in the face of adversity. And if you look back at the model the curve there. You can see there it lands us, at the bottom as we look up now towards integration. And this is where, we start to really engage with the new situation. Although it can sometimes feel like a breakthrough, when we're getting out of that depressive stage, it doesn't always feel nice. So this is something that's quite important to mention, because if you remember some of the physiological markers of depression, that's associated with the low. And so when you're low, you actually want to bounce back. But when you're getting out of some form of precipice, it's also a process that requires self-compassion, because your inner voice might confuse you with things like, well, what am I supposed to do? I can't do this anymore. I should just give up. And, many individuals actually find themselves unable to move past that depression stage because they don't have, the patience to really pull through. So in the next slide, I want to talk a bit more about that experiment stage, because Scott mentioned what that was like for him. But what it's often characterized as is understanding. And this is simply when, you kind of notice that, okay, this change has happened and there's actually nothing I can do about it. The second one is about, gradual acceptance. It's not complete acceptance, but it's a space where you find yourself saying, well, maybe this is who I am now. Maybe this is what my reality is. So how can I adapt and focus on the things that I can control? There's also a level of optimism because, in this stage, when we start to experiment, we start to explore new opportunities, ways of doing things different. And so it's about that kind of nothing to lose mentality and all about trying. And you heard Scott talk about that and really emphasize on that in his story as well. And we also kind of invite a level of negotiation, because right then we're kind of weighing the pros and cons to see, well, what would feel best? What do I gain here? What do I lose there? And this is also what brings in this testing period, because we start to try new things, and in this stage, we might not be so productive. It's quite important to say that, because expecting quick results might actually just set you back. And so again, as I mentioned earlier, putting too much pressure on yourself or having high expectations might counteract the level of patience and resilience that you can actually build if you stay the course. Because as humans, the pursuit of pleasure, if you think about giving up, pressure from work or stress, for example, can, drive our decisions to really power through or make radical changes. But although the grass may always be greener on the other side, decisions that are made only and solely through with emotions are not always the best decisions. And so in the next slide, here's, some tips on what you can do. Firstly, really just give yourself that time again to just test out if it's a new routine that you're trying. Even just if you're seeking support, if you need to ask for help, give people the time to respond to you. Share your plans and ideas with someone you trust. Again, it helps you just live outside of your head. Share or maybe try some short visualizations. This is something that for people who don't like meditation per se, visualization is something that gets you to see things or even imagine new possibilities and start to see who the next you or, what good looks like in terms of embodying that experiment and moving through the change. You can also try pressing the fast forward button. And this is a really interesting tip as someone, and I didn't share it as part of my story, but addiction is part of my background. And this is something that we're taught to kind of almost play the tape forward or towards the end. It helps take away that idea of, the romantic success that we get by cutting corners, and just grounds, individuals in the fact that if they do cut corners or escape from their sobriety, here are the consequences that might happen. So if you apply it to your change, it might just help you to avoid or even start to write down what taking a drastic decision might, or might come up as, or even might show up as in the end in terms of results. The last one really is about considering, mentoring. Scott talked about having a mentor. Mentoring helps you really reflect on the ideas of success in any situation by looking to people who've gone through the same situation before. What have they done? You can also look to coaching as well, which is a way to, support you when it comes to putting a plan together and having more guidance in order to make important decisions. So if we now go to the next stage, which is about decision on that word, we really land on the fact that people often say that it's quite hard, to make decisions in general. And unfortunately, we all have to do them because we either stay stuck or we decide and move through. But, where the previous stages, and specifically the experiment stage, was around considering, all of your options and opportunity, decision is simply just about three things. You want to choose the best possible option, you want to plan, and just execute. And most of us actually can be quite ignorant about the mental process that kind of lies behind our decisions. And so for us in the work that we do, it's become a very interesting topic of investigation. And people have, advertised or even expressed or presented some of the most common problems that prevent people from making, effective decisions. And these are, very quickly not having enough decisions or enough information, feeling overwhelmed. Sometimes if you think about having too much going on, well, you might want to just restrict that data in order to process it easier. If you think about having too much information, I meant to say too much information, which is where you get overwhelmed. The next one, which is more around not having enough information, where you feel underwhelmed with the fact that you don't have a clear picture as to where to go. Maybe if you think about, your change involving family members or colleagues as well, it might just be that there's too many people to consider. And so it might just be essential in that moment to realize that only you are the one, specifically if that change impacts you in the greatest sense, only you are the one who is, able to take responsibility and be accountable for the decision that you make. Number 4 actually is quite interesting because it's about hidden interests. And this is where, when we're not clear about our motivations, things can actually kind of get blocked up. So you want to be aware of that. You also want to be aware of your emotional attachment, really, because a decision, in a sense, is about, people being able to move through things. And so if there's too many emotions that are blocking you, it might put you back in a position where you're not making a decision after all. And no emotional attachment sometimes actually can just mean that, well, there's not enough incentive for you to move forward. Luckily, in the work that we do and what we've seen with our clients as well, a lot of people have found ways that were helpful to make better decisions as well. And here are just some quick tips that we want to share with you once again. We all know about the gut feeling, and to a certain extent, the gut actually holds a lot of information and a lot of knowledge and wisdom. So exploring your gut feeling might be a great option, but it's important to remember that before you throw away your pros and cons, if the choice that you make is highly emotive, your instinct might just, not serve you well in the end. The second one is about labeling your emotions, because I talked about motivations as well, and simply noticing emotions and notifications, I was going to say, but motivations actually might simply help you connect with what's really driving you. Third one is just simply play the devil's advocate. It's always important to assess whether you're biased or not to the decision that you're making. The other one is just about being aware of social pressure. When we say keep your eye on the ball, it's about what's important for you and what you need in order to drive forward and move through the change that you're experiencing. The last two really is about fearing consequences. There's a really beautiful saying that says, whatever the future holds, it will hurt in some extent, but to a certain extent, it might please you less as well than you imagine. So it's kind of about releasing any expectations and just moving through what is in front of you. And lastly, another powerful way of punctuating that is talking to someone you trust, or even talking to yourself as well, like a trusted friend, because we may not all have our support network available. And so if you can speak to yourself and give yourself that space as you would another friend, you might be able to look at opportunities a little bit more objectively. So lastly, really, in terms of the change curve, we'll go through the integration stage, which is, I believe, where everybody wants to be. Because if you think about, moving through experiment, going through decision, we're making plans, and our emotions as well are improving. And so we start to take ownership and accountability for our change. But from here on out, we maybe stop focusing on what we've lost, But when we start to rebuild and we start to make commitments, it can also be quite tough because life in itself is filled with so many distractions. And sometimes there may be many changes happening at once. And so just to preface that and support you through this, here are some very quick tools that can help you strengthen your resolution or commitment, or even just build some rock solid habits as well that can keep you moving forward and sustain a level of change that you want to see. So the first one is about writing a commitment contract, or even journaling on a daily about this commitment that you want to make. A real interesting one is just starting with why, because if you don't know why you're making this change, if you don't know what you're committing to and why, chances are you're not actually going to do anything. Just remind yourself as a second point to, that, well, you're actually your most important project. I always say to my clients that at the end of the day, if I'm not working and I'm unwell, nothing's working. And Scott talked about having those boundaries. And so this is where you can actually reflect on what you need in order to move forward. Affirming your values. This is a really important one. I know some people actually do this work often, but just to put it out there, it's quite important to know what is most important to you. And these are your values. And once you do that, you're able to really set a reward, because you're making a change for what reason? It doesn't have to be so tedious. And once you set that reward as well, you can start to celebrate and give yourself, a bit of a pat on the back, which is sometimes very needed. The last two, finding your tribe is about building community, coming together with people who are like-minded and will support you in your process of change. And the last one is actually a really interesting preface to the next webinar that we have, is about creating a routine, because routine is so important and it really helps us set our intention and allow for a level of consistency in what can allow us to even feel normal in the face of change. So just the last kind of words really, as we close and wrap up on the curve. The reason why we really talk about change is to talk about the difference as well that most people experience when we're aware of the change that we're going through. We're actually making a distinction here from reacting versus responding. Because as you see there, a reaction is simply, based on the moment. And this is something that doesn't take into consideration the long-term effect of what you do or what you say. It's also about survival. And this is when, at the early stages of the curve, we're very much in that survival mode, anxious, depressive, and really tunnel visioned. But as we move through, we're able, with awareness, to start to respond. Because reaction is perfectly normal as well, but a response, however, is based on information from both our conscious and unconscious mind. And it takes into consideration the well-being of others, but also our own well-being. And it really helps weigh out the long-term effects of the change that we seek to make. And so this is where, I find this kind of sentence very powerful. When we think about reacting, it's all about emotion, but responding is about emotional intelligence. And as we close here and go towards questions, I just want to let you know that there's a powerful term called post-traumatic growth, which is something that most of us will often, maybe if we process and we become aware of what's happened in our own transition, we'll be better able to understand. And what it says is that post-traumatic growth is, the positive psychological change that is experienced as a result of a struggle that we highly, challenged us in a very powerful manner. And if you think about where you are now, it might be important to reflect on what that change was like and who you've become, because it might just be that no matter how you look at it, you've been able to grow in this process. And so what we really invite you to do is about seeing change, welcoming it, using some of the specific tools that feel right for you, but it's also about cultivating a relationship with impermanence. Because at the end of the day, as John Maxwell would say, change is inevitable, but growth is optional. And when you give yourself the tools and the network and the support to move through change, anything essentially is possible. So I'm just kind of mindful of time there. I know that there were a couple of questions that were answered. Michael, I know that you answered some of them as well in the chat there. Scott as well, I'm wondering if you had anything that we can kind of put out there.
I would just pick one off. I answered one that was more of a reflection, but I would just pick one off. Someone asked, what is a good coping mechanism for feeling so overwhelmed that you almost don't know where to start? So, one thing that I've just come to embrace is there's always more demands on your time than you will have time. So just grow comfortable that that's always going to be the case. One of the things that I've found super useful is as you make your list, ask yourself what bad thing happens if this one slips, doesn't get done on time, or doesn't get done at all. And I've found that is really helpful in helping me figure out where to start. Right? Doing your taxes, for example. What bad thing happens if you don't do them? You go to jail. You should probably do them. My suspicion is that not everything on your list is going to have that kind of a consequence. So that'll help you kind of, get them prioritized. You'll also find that other people will be happy to set the urgency or priority of the things on your to-do list. That doesn't always mean that they get to go to the highest level of your urgency, right? So again, just something that's worked for me, ask yourself what bad thing happens if this slips or doesn't get done on time.
Awesome, Scott. I'm going to pick actually two, I think, that were presented about, noticing a loved one or coworker who's going through some of the stages or all the stages, or even as well, someone who's struggling to kind of share their feelings. I think if you took anything away from this workshop, from this webinar, is that these are tools, but there's not one size fits all. And at the end of the day, when we're engaging in conversation with individuals who we care about, it's about holding space. It's not about having the answers, because the moment we start telling people what to do, essentially you can imagine they just withdraw. So creating a space where they can just share and openly, and you holding that space for them to just tell you what's going on, how they're feeling, might just be the best first step. And then eventually you may want to look to supporting them even further, checking in on a regular basis. And again, if things get too hard and complicated, you might suggest that they get some professional support. But it's about just gauging where they're at. But essentially, I would say just making that space for people to just know that they're held, know that they're feeling seen is what always matters as well. And
someone also asks here, is a secret to delivering on a big plan is to start out with small steps? Absolutely. I think research will show over and over and over again that that's the only way to make lasting, meaningful impact. I was just going to recommend a book called Atomic Habits. There's so many good data points in that book about the long-term impact of small changes. Small changes are easy, big changes are hard. And small changes last, and they have really large, impactful elements over time.
Great. I'm going to pick one. Someone's asked, are all 7 stages always present, or are just some present for other people? I think all 7 stages are always present. It just depends what else is going on in your life as to the duration of certain stages. We're all going through these different curves at different stages. And some of us might even have multiple curves going on as well, depending on the number of changes that are going on. So yes, I think it's about kind of noticing where you're at and then using the specific kind of tools and practices that we've presented to move you on to the next stage so that you don't get stuck.
Yeah. I think just on the back of what Michael said, it's just awareness, because you don't know what you don't know. So how do you know you're in denial if you're not actually aware of what's going on for you? So with the tools that you have, it's just about writing things down or being able to speak through where you're at. And maybe with someone else's feedback, you might just be able to notice that, oh, this is what's going on. Is that denial? Am I feeling depressed? Is there anxiety? Or am I just now just feeling more free and trying new things out? And where do I get the support in order to move forward?
Someone's asked about overthinking and does this result in all these stages? I think overthinking is often a symptom of certain stages. So, for example, kind of depression and frustration, and it can often, we call them loops. So it's this idea of getting stuck and going round and round and not being able to see the bigger picture, not being able to see new opportunities, and not being able to really see the path forward, which is kind of what it's all about. It's about acknowledging that you can't go back, but what are my options to move forward?
It's a really good one as well. I think, Scott, maybe you want to have a look at the one that says, with work and children, I struggle with ever putting time for myself as a priority. Any suggestions really on how to get started, how to affirm to colleagues and family that I'm going to start doing so?
Yeah, look, I think you have to make space for yourselves. You know, never make apologies that you're, you know, having to make space to take care of your children. I was on a call just yesterday where two people actually apologized for having to make lunch. One was making lunch for their child. I'm like, yes, your child needs lunch and that should be a priority. And then, you know, another for making noise. Never ever make apologies for taking care of your family. And, you know, don't make apologies for making space for yourself. It is critically important. And, you know, surround yourself with people who understand that. Somebody said advice for students. So I don't know if I have any great advice, but I do have 3 students under my watch, my 3 boys. You know, one thing I try to encourage them to understand is, like, I remember being a student as old as I am, and remember so much uncertainty and like just wondering and worrying, like, you know, is all of this ever going to work out? It works out. Like, I can just assure you that, you know, that uncertainty is there for literally everyone. And, you know, as well as it seems to be going for the other students around you, they got internships, I didn't, whatever it is, relax, take a deep breath. It all works out in the end. Focus on the things that are in your control, and know that everyone is, you know, going through a very similar situation, and you're not alone in that journey.
Great. I think that's all of the questions. I've actually just put a link to our next workshop in the chat. Maybe we can quickly talk through that. And I've also put a support link as well. So if anyone does need to find any support that isn't available within your organization, then I've put a really good website there, which has lots of free resources that you're able to kind of go and look at in your own time. Melis, do you just want to quickly give an overview of the next one?
Yeah, I mean, for the next one, we really want to hone in on the fact that when we're working from home, Scott touched on this as well, you know, about the fact that things are changing, but we also need to adapt. And this one will go a bit deeply into, well, creating a personalized routine, because using Scott's, you know, routine and the key tips that he did only worked for him, but what works for you? And this is what we want to get to. So we'll be giving you tools and ideas as to how to even start framing a routine that's personal to you, but also incorporating, you know, some holistic practices as well that might help reinforce the changes that you're making. And we talked about as well, you know, boundaries, and that's part of it, because if you want to sustain your routine, it's about making that time for yourself. And I think throughout, we've just emphasized that it's about seeing yourself as your most important project and your most important priority. So we'll help you kind of talk into some of the challenges and conflicts that we may encounter in these processes, but also give you some tools as well to counteract them, and maybe start to engage in conversations with others who are in your space and might be able to also support you in carrying your routine and empower you to, you know, make a greater change moving forward. And yeah.
Awesome. That'd be great. Melis, Michael, can't thank you enough for leading the conversation, and thanks for all of you for tuning in. It's such an important topic. We're all in this together, and, you know, change is the constant for every single one of us. So look forward to seeing everyone in the next session. Until that time, continue to take care of yourself and look after the well-being of yourself and those around you. Take care, everyone. Stay safe.